Okay, IB1 history. How's it going? Okay, so as part of the double header this week, we are going to be looking at the domestic impact of Hitler's foreign policy. So basically, how did his international decisions affect his maintenance of power? But before we get started on that, we have to know what his objectives were. So Hitler's main foreign policy objective was basically the destruction of the Versailles settlement, right? So you should know that sort of very well right now. But basically, Hitler hated the Versailles Treaty, as did most Germans. And when he came to power, his goal was to ultimately destroy it, to restore German pride, restore the German military, redress some of the issues that Versailles had basically forced upon Germany. Right, so that was it. Now, in order to do this, he needed to build up the German military, which in and of itself was a breach of the Treaty of Versailles. But that was something that he pretty much starts immediately and something that he continues, obviously, as he launches the war against the rest of the world. So this cartoon here is interpreted by me as sort of being, you've got this vice-like tight Versailles Treaty squeezing Germany and Hitler pulling them out of it and saying, no, we're not listening to this anymore. It was a diktat. It was not a negotiated settlement. You never beat us on the battlefield. This is a horrendous, horrendous treaty. So everything he basically does is attempting to destroy it. Now, we have to look at the foreign policy's impact on his maintenance of power really from sort of two time periods, right? And so the first one is roughly 35 to 42, and the second one from 43 to 45, all right? So it's just sort of rough dates as to sort of when you can sort of see this shift on how his foreign policy making decisions sort of impacted him domestically. So the first one, the earlier years, and the majority of his time, was characterized by phenomenal international successes in the pre-war period and stunning victories in the first years of the war. So, in the lead up to the war from 35 to 39, Hitler embarks on a series of incredibly successful, almost gambles, if you will, which don't lead to war because there is no international response. And it was incredibly popular. I mean, he was seen as sort of restoring German pride. And I'm going to get into a little bit more detail later, but really does help maintain and grow Nazi support and Hitler's sort of infallibility as this great leader. From 43 to 45, though, you really have a changing of opinions as the war starts to deteriorate. All right. So in June of 1941, he invades the Soviet Union. And when the Soviets eventually turn the tide in 43, it's basically just this nonstop onslaught and German retreat all the way back to Berlin and the eventual, sort of loss of the war by middle of 1945. Now, obviously, there were Western allies, and there was a sort of great grand alliance of the Soviet Union and the Americans and the British and things like that. But internally, it increases sort of anti-Hitler sentiment within the military, and that links very nicely to the opposition PowerPoint, which you've probably already looked at, which was, the failed assassination attempts in 43, all six of them, and then, of course, the failed one, Operation Valkyrie, in 44. So you can start to see that people in the military, high-ranking German officers, not Nazi Party members, are really sort of saying, wow, this guy is screwing it up for us. And then that as the losses begin to mount, the cult of infallibility starts to disintegrate. And although it doesn't necessarily lead to a whole lot of opposition, really, there's a growing belief that Hitler is not who he sort of characterized, who they thought he was earlier, and who he's characterized himself to be. So we'll go into more detail, but let's look now at what those challenges were to the Versailles settlement. So what does he do? So initially he starts the rearmament program. It begins in 1933. By 1935, he has thousands of airplanes, sort of taking to the skies in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. And he's also increased his military by 300% within the first couple of years. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a little bit more detail later. In March of 1936, he remilitarizes the Rhineland. So this was part of the Treaty of Versailles. This was German territory, but they were not allowed to put any military in it. It was to act as a buffer zone between Germany and France and Belgium. He doesn't listen, marches his troops right in, and an advanced warning scout of the French army notices this, and interestingly enough, tells his superiors that he believes that the fighting force of the Germans was about 250,000 troops, when in fact the reality was it was actually only 20,000. And even more interestingly enough, Hitler had actually given the orders to his military commanders that if they faced any resistance in occupation or remilitarization of the Rhineland, that they were to return. They were to turn back and head back towards Germany. But this obviously doesn't happen. And there was no international response. The Americans, the British, and the French, they don't do anything. So this emboldens Hitler to go even further, and he annexes Austria. So he incorporates Austria into the German Reich, and again does so without firing a single shot. He then begins the process of the destruction of Czechoslovakia, first beginning with the occupation of the Sudetenland, which, as you can see, is in green, which sort of rims part of Germany and borders Austria as well. And it was highly ethnic German. It was actually German territory, which had been given to this new state of Czechoslovakia at the end of Versailles. So he initially starts with that, and then basically at the end of the Munich conference breaks his agreement that was agreed upon by the leaders at Munich, and takes the rest of Czechoslovakia by basically middle of 1938. And then, of course, that's when everybody says, oh, we can't trust Hitler anymore. And they make pledges to Poland that if Germany invades Poland, they will declare war. Well, Germany invades Poland. On September the 1st, 1939 is when the official sort of start date of World War II in Europe begins. And this is sort of now what we're going to look at is what impact did these decisions that he made have on the domestic population. So, as you can see, this map here is the invasion or the occupation of the Rhineland, March 7, 1936, and it's sort of the beginning of the growth of the Third Reich. But before that, I wanted to note that, as odd as it may seem, conscription, mandatory military conscription for males in 1935 was a very bold move by Hitler, because again, that had been stated as not being allowed by the Treaty of Versailles. And it was actually largely supported by the civilian population because they viewed it as this reassertion of German power and prestige in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. So by making military service mandatory, he increased his support base from the German people, because again, most Germans really didn't like the Treaty of Versailles, and this was now a guy who was coming and, addressing their concerns and destroying elements of the Treaty of Versailles. So he was very, very popular. And furthermore, the 1936 remilitarization, without a single shot being fired, made him hugely popular. Again, it demonstrates the strength of Hitler, the power of Germany, and also this destruction and the throwing away of the shackles of Versailles. So again, a really sort of key couple of things that he does, which really help him solidify his power in those early years and maintain it. So we're going to continue. We're going to look at some of the other things. I think it's really important to note that part of the success of Hitler was due to the inability or the lack of reaction by the Western democracies, right? So he does all these things, and he should have been stopped, right, by the League of Nations. They should have come together. They should have thwarted any more attempts by Hitler to actually increase the size of Germany, but they don't, right? So there's this weakness here that's presented by the League, by the British, by the French, and by the Americans. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I'm not going to go into them. You study them more in depth in paper 1. But it's just really important to note that he's able to get away with a lot of these things because there is no reaction to them. So he gets more emboldened. He gets more aggressive. That's why he's able to annex Austria. He says, well, they didn't do anything for the Rhineland, so they're not going to do anything for Austria, and shit, they're not going to do anything for Czechoslovakia. They probably won't even do anything for Poland. And that's, of course, the big mistake. So in 1938, when he annexes Austria, it's known as the Anschluss, and incorporates the Sudetenland into the Third Reich, there was no response, right? And so he's challenging the Treaty of Versailles. And even people who kind of cautiously said, no, that's not a good idea. Don't challenge the Treaty of Versailles. We can't have war again. Even the doubters started to think, man, they're not doing anything about it. Let's go Hitler, like right on. So as he corrects these wrongs, Hitler's cult of personality, his infallibility, and his grip on power sort of increase immeasurably. So he goes through this massive increase in popularity across the board as his foreign policy successes increase. And he's now being viewed as the defender of German rights. And this is really important. This is a people who had lost their pride. They had been beaten down. They had been, sort of forced a horrendous peace, by their European neighbors. And again, these are very proud people. There was, decades of Germany being the power of Europe, right? I mean, we saw that with Bismarck. And so they were looking for strength. They were looking for leadership. They were looking for somebody who was strong, and basically Hitler gave them that. I want to note here as well that it's not just foreign policy that helps maintain his power. There's obviously other things. He's very, very good. He brings back an incredible amount of jobs. He stimulates industrial production. He's very charismatic. He uses force in order to maintain his power, right? So this is only one aspect of him attempting to maintain his power. It's an important one, but in an essay about maintenance of power, you do need to also look at other factors. Okay, so I think at the end, what I want to do right now with this sort of, finishing off this section is to give you some quotes that you could really use in an essay that would really help, boost your understanding and really sort of prove to an IB examiner that you know what you're talking about. So number one, support in all sections of the German people and unparalleled popularity, prestige, and acclaim is what Ian Kershaw says of the foreign policy. So Ian Kershaw is a very famous historian. Put it in there. Also, he notes that there was incredible triumph without bloodshed, right? So again, this is very popular for Hitler. He makes all of these things, but he does it without shooting a shot. So this has become exceptionally popular amongst the civilian population. Remember, this is a population that went through the war as well. They're not looking for conflict yet. He's pushing them towards it, but they're not looking for it yet. So he can remilitarize, take Czechoslovakia, take Austria without firing a bullet. Exceptionally popular. Edgar Feuchtwanger, sorry for the German pronunciation or lack thereof, was actually a German refugee in 1938, and he has become a very famous sort of British-German historian. And he says, quote, that Hitler's apparently sensationally effective coups in foreign policy were fundamental to his hold on the German people, and therefore his hold on power. So great quotes to put in an essay about this. So just keep those in mind. And this is where perhaps a little bit more level of detail would really sort of help your grade. So now let's look at sort of the foreign policy from 39 to 45. And this is kind of a tale of two, this can even be split, right? Even down the middle. 39 to 41, 42 are incredible, right? I mean, the successes of the earlier decade makes Hitler this sort of prisoner of his own myth and imagined infallibility. He basically thinks that he cannot be defeated. And so with the invasion of Poland in 1939, he essentially sets in motion a chain of decisions which will ultimately break the chain of success, right? So 39, exceptionally successful. He takes Poland in 6 weeks. He turns his military towards the west. He takes the Benelux countries, Belgium, Norway, Luxembourg. He takes Norway, Denmark. He wipes the floor with France in 4-6 weeks. So it's unbelievable. Nobody's ever seen this type of military, strategies, this blitzkrieg use before. Um, Totally unprepared for it. But basically, by 1941, Hitler is sitting pretty as this incredibly dominant, smart, brilliant, infallible, godlike military commander who cannot be defeated. His popularity is unrivaled. And then he essentially, in June of 1941, bites off more than he can chew and invades the Soviet Union. It was called Operation Barbarossa, and initially, it was tremendously successful. The Soviets were not ready. They were disorganized. They were kind of not prepared. They were kind of a little bit caught off guard by this. I don't know why, but they shouldn't have been, but they were. And They basically had to retreat, and they retreated hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. And basically, within the first sort of 6 months to a year, the German onslaught is looking like it's actually going to take the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is going to collapse. But they defend Moscow, they defend Stalingrad, and basically by the winter of 42 and spring of 43, Germany's supply lines are stretched thin, and they are not able to conduct the war. This blitzkrieg doesn't really work in the Soviet Union the way that they want to. And in that time, Soviet industrial production ramps up, and it's nothing but a 2-year retreat by the German military as the steamroller of the Soviet Union comes crashing in. And from the middle of 1943 until 1945, it's basically just successive defeat, retreat by the German military, attempt to counterattack, stretch your supply lines too thin, and that's it. They're done. And so basically by 1945, May of 1945, the war in Europe is over. So it's interesting to note that his foreign policy successes make him immensely popular and help maintain his power. His foreign policy failures kind of do the opposite, right? So they gain him immeasurable popularity, but his failures provoke a string of internal opposition. Now, granted, not immediately successful internal opposition. The coup attempt, the assassination attempts all fail. His Gestapo is still exceptionally strong, but there's a growing resentment to Hitler. There's a growing, he's kind of not the leader that we thought he was. And so there's this growing discontent within German society. It doesn't really amount to anything really important, but what does, because ultimately what crushes Hitler is the external opposition, right? So his foreign policy decisions create a grand alliance of the Soviet Union, Britain, and its colonies, and eventually the French army after they gave up, but then they come back, and the Americans and the American powerhouse, and so eventually they just kind of squeeze and start to choke off Germany in the center of Europe. So essentially Hitler's foreign policy unleashes his own downfall, right? Like he made these decisions, and that's what crushes Germany in the end. And so, at the same time that it made him exceptionally popular, it was the result. It caused his downfall simultaneously, right? So, I wanted to note this photo in the top right-hand corner is a Soviet soldier raising the Soviet Union flag in Berlin. And this bottom right, there was an excellent movie made called Downfall, and it's about Hitler's last days in the bunker in Berlin. It's a German foreign language film. Excellent. Highly recommended. So in conclusion, therefore, because Hitler's foreign policies work both ways. They help him increase his popularity. They bring his downfall. All right? So make sure that you can distinguish between these two in an essay. Don't have one without the other. And bring in some of those quotes. And if you want any more information, William Scherer wrote sort of the definitive work called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. It's an excellent, excellent, in-depth look at the rise and fall of Hitler. So, that's it for today. We are going to move on next week to your essay. So I will be sort of giving you some of those questions. And that's pretty much it. So have yourselves a wonderful day, wonderful week, wonderful weekend, and I'll talk to you in class. Bye.